Shalom. Before I get started, I want to give all praises to Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Bahashim, Rakak Wadash. As always, double honors to the apostles, elder bishops of Great Millstone. Double honors to the high priest elders that were before them. Peace and salutations to you sincere brothers out there pushing this word without sincerity and in truth. It's a brother Tazamak from the Great Millstone Austin camp, and Lord willing, this lesson be edifying. All right, I want to go into this couple articles. Forgive me, my throat is a little dry. Concerning I got some information here, but this article, it goes into words matter case study and goes into how the so-called Europeans, all right, which the Europeans, it tells you in this article right here in American Indian. It's a little history. I was doing some, history in this whole Europeans when they landed here in the 1493, which the European nations, it says, we're going to start off from here. Discovery 1493. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, European nations engaged in extensive overseas exploration, with Spain and Portugal competing as the two dominant powers. And this is ultimately where the so-called white man, all right, came back out of. All right, that was their, like it says here, their two dominant powers, man. All right, so the European nations, which in the scriptures, all right, those were the biblical Edomites, man. All right, which are the self-proclaimed white people today. All right, the European descendants from Spain, Portugal, go back to the nation of Edom. All right, the self-proclaimed white man today, which Edom goes translated in the Hebrew is Adawam, which means red. All right, and Edom in the scriptures is a nation that the Lord Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai has an indignation forever. They have a pending judgment, and according to the scriptures, they are going to get exterminated because they are the wicked. All right, and before I proceed, all right, the Heavenly Father, his name, his true and holy name is Yahweh, which means he exists. And the beloved Son, all right, who this world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ, his true and holy name is Yahweh Shai, which means he saves, he delivers. All right. And yeah, so let's get this real quick. I had typed in here in the Google AI, indigenous people were savages according to Europeans, which the indigenous people, right, the as you can see here, the so-called Seminole Indians, North American Indians, they're Israelites, man. All right, and the nation of Israel consists of you so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. All right, and the scriptures talk about in the Obadiah 1 and 10, which Obadiah is a book concerning the nation of Edom. All right, which historically the European, Spain and as we read here, and Portugal, the two dominant powers of the Edomites, man. All right, verse 10, which is a point. All right, Obadiah chapter 1 and verse 10, and it reads, "For thy violence against thy brother Jacob," which are the Israelites, so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, "for thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever." All right, which we gonna go back to this now, and it says European colonizers labeled indigenous peoples as savages to justify the invasion, the displacement, and destruction of their societies, man. Because as you go down, we're going to keep reading. It says, in reality, indigenous nations had highly organized governments, complex trade networks, and sophisticated ways of living with nature. Europeans used different versions of this myth to suit their needs. The brutal savage. It says colonizers, which keep in mind, these European colonizers are Edomites. All right. They are the nation of Edom. And history proves, man, because as we read Obadiah, and this whole chapter, or this whole book, which is a chapter, is basically to and is prophecy concerning the nation of Edom. All right. And where was I? Let's get this. It says the brutal, savage colonizers called indigenous people uncivilized to portray their land grabs and violence against native communities as bringing order. Let's get this word savage. The word savage means fierce, wild, violent, or uncivilized. All right, which ultimately the real savage, all right, the real savages are you so-called white people, man, which are the Edomites in the scriptures. All right, the European colonizers, they were the real uncivilized savages, because according to the scriptures, man, the nation of Israel were a separate people, a holy people. All right, unto our power, Yahweh Shem Yahweh Shai. This is Deuteronomy 7:6. For thou art a holy people unto the Lord Yahweh thy power. The Lord Yahweh thy power hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth. So how could it be that we were uncivilized when the Lord declared us to be a special people unto himself, man? All right, a people with order. Okay. When you read the book of Exodus, it tells you how, all right, the Israelites, built, they would work with bricks and mortar, all right, build cities, okay, construct things. All right, we are a special people unto Yahweh Shem Yahweh Shai, so there is no damn way we were uncivilized, man. Okay, let's keep reading. It says, let's go down to the false claim of uncivilized. Europeans often assumed their own way of life was the only correct way to live, which, there's historical accounts, man, that tell you that these Edomites, all right, these Europeans didn't shower. They smelled horrible. They came with diseases, man. Teeth were rotting, man, they were scumbags, all right? Europeans often assumed that their own way of life was the only correct way to live. They viewed indigenous people as savage because of differences in areas like religion, land use, and government. All right, it says, because many indigenous nations use democratic, consensus-based systems of leadership rather than European monarchies, because we had our own way of living. All right, but ultimately, when let's get this precept real quick in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 15. All right, because we were given laws, statutes, and commandments as a people to abide in these commandments, so that we would be a separate people, from the rest of these heathen nations, man. Because there's 18 nations in the scriptures, in the Bible. 18 nations today. Well, all these nations today go back to 18 nations in the scriptures. And the Lord is only dealing with one specific nation, the nation of Israel, the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. All right, but Deuteronomy 28 and verse 15, it tells you, but it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord Yahweh thy power, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. All right. And ultimately, we were smitten. Verse 22 tells you the Lord shall smite thee with a consumption and with a fever and with an inflammation and with an extreme burning and with the sword and with blasting with mildew, and they shall pursue thee until thou perish, man. Let's get let me see. I had it. It goes into damn. Okay, yes, verse 49. The Lord Yahweh shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth. Keep in mind, these Europeans came from the Europe, Spain and Portugal in particular. It says, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. And he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle and the fruit of thy land until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy kind, or flocks of thy sheep, until he have destroyed thee. And that's exactly ultimately what these Europeans, these colonizers, they did. Let's get a little bit on the noble savage. Later European writers created the idea of the noble savage. This was an image of an innocent, pure person untouched by the greed of European civilization. While meant as a compliment, it was still a stereotype that did not recognize indigenous people as modern eco societies. All right, so these European colonizers, they labeled the indigenous people as savages to justify their invasion, justify their wild savage acts, man, because the real savage, all right, were you so-called Europeans, man. Y'all were fierce, y'all were wild, man, y'all were violent or uncivilized, man. Let's get Christopher, let me get something real quick. Christopher Columbus not put his, let's get some of that, man. Let me see. Okay, because there was a, man, maybe I didn't type it right, but there was a saying that Christopher Columbus, what the hell? It completely corrected it wrong. That he could not put his sword down. Let's type that up and see what comes up. All right, all right, let me see. It says, it sounds like you might be thinking of the famous historical anecdote against Saint. All right, let me see what it says. No. Yeah, this ain't it. Anyways, maybe it's one of these sayings, but the whole point is that these conquistadors were bloodthirsty murderers, man. All right. Let me see. They committed a genocide, man. It says the systematic destruction and displacement of Native American populations by European colonizers and the United States government is a heavily documented historical atrocity that many modern historians and institutions classify as genocide. All right, you see? Now, they did all that in the name of Christianity. The European Christians, man. They got down the way they did, and ultimately their justification was that they were, that was the Christ way. All right. Let me see. Give me a sec. Yep, forced displacement and ethnic cleansing. The Indian Removal Act, 1830. This law authorized the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands to designated Indian territory. The Trail of Tears, man. All right, there's, numerous acts that show you what these people did, man. The atrocities these original savages did. These murderers, man. Let's get Psalms 50 real quick. And it says in AMP, the Most High, the judge of the righteous and the wicked. All right. And the wicked are you so-called Edomites, man. Malachi chapter 1 and verse 4. All right. Let's get Malachi started from the top. The burden of the word of the Lord Yahweh to Israel by Malachi. Malachi was a prophet. It says, I have loved you, saith the Lord Yahweh. Yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother? All right, because this goes back to twin brothers, man. Esau, Edom, the self-proclaimed white man, and Jacob, the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. When you go into the account, they were twin brothers in Genesis 25, the same mother, all right, same father. One was rejected and one was blessed. It says, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord Yahweh? Yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau, and laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. Point 4 is the point. Whereas Edom saith, we are impoverished, but we will return and build the desolate places. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh of hosts, they shall build, but I will throw down, and they shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom the Lord Yahweh hath indignation forever. And around, as we read earlier, the 1493, all right, 1492, the 1400s, these Edomites were going back into power, man. All right, but before that, when you go to the history of Europe, they had the Dark Ages, all right, the Byzantine Empire, which, the so-called Negroes, Judah, Benjamin, and Levi were ruling in Europe, man, for 1,000 years, the Dark Ages. Okay, but point is, let me get Psalms 50. It says, the Most High, the judge of the righteous and the wicked, and the righteous are the Israelites, man. All right, so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans. Let's get Psalms 50 and verse. Let's get verse 16. It says, but unto the wicked, the Most High saith, what hast thou to do to declare my statutes, or that thou shouldest take my covenant in thy mouth? Seeing thou hatest instruction, and casteth my words behind thee. Because what was one of the commandments Yahweh Shem Yahushai gave to the nation of Israel? That to not murder, okay, to not kill. All right, which there's a difference when you do it willingly, and you can do it when you self-defense. All right, well, Esau, Edom, he's a straight murderer, man. All right, and the scriptures tell you that also in Ezekiel 35, man. But let's continue reading in Psalms 50 real quick. Verse 17, seeing thou hatest instruction, and casteth my words behind thee. When thou sawest a thief, then thou consents with him, and hast been partaker with adulterers. Let's see what it says in the AMP. When you see a thief, you are pleased with him and condone his behavior, and you associate with adulterers, because Esau, Edom, he's a thief also. And that's why he condones that behavior, because he relates to it. And as we read earlier, they stole the lands, all right? They invaded the lands under the name of colonialism, because they were savages, etc., man. Let's continue reading Psalms 50. Verse 19, thou givest thy mouth to evil, and thy tongue frameth deceit. How many peace treaties did these so-called Europeans, man, break with the so-called Native Americans, man, Seminole Indians, etc., indigenous tribes, ultimately They are Israelites, man. They go back to the seed of Jacob. Verse 20, thou sittest and speakest against thy brother, thou slanderest thy own mother's son. Remember, Esau and Jacob had their twin brothers that had the same mother. That's how you know this is speaking about Esau, Edom, the wicked. All right. What did they say? They're savages, man. They're uncivilized. They're they're not equal. They're not humans ultimately, man. That's what they were saying. All right. Verse 21, these things hast thou done and not kept silence. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such as one as thyself, but I will reprove thee and set them in order before thine eyes. All right. And the Most High set us in order starting in 1969, 1970. All right. Divine intervention, man. The Most High put his spirit, Yahweh Shem Yahushai put the spirit, his spirit into a high priest elder known as Abba Bivens, which is history, man. All right. That's how the order came in first. But these Europeans, man, these Edomites, all right, so-called Europeans thought that the Most High was with them because he was allowing them to do that, not knowing that these were all part of the curses, man. You can read this in Deuteronomy 28 after 15, those curses, man. But let's go back to this real quick. Psalms 50. Let's finish that up. And oh, you know what? That was it on verse 21. Now I want to get Ezekiel 35, man. And I'm going to end it up with that. Ezekiel 35. Moreover, the word of the Lord Yahweh came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Mount Seir and prophesy against it. And Mount Seir is another word for the nation of Edom. All right, just how Jerusalem is another title for the people of Israel. Well, Mount Seir is another title for the people of Edom. And prophesy against it. And say unto it, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Power, behold, O Mount Seir, I am against thee, and I will stretch out my hand against thee, and I will make thee most desolate. I will lay thy cities waste, and thou shalt be desolate. And thou shalt know that I am the Lord Yahweh, because the wicked Esau, Edom, he is in control right now. He is ruling the earth right now. According to Job 9:24, tells you that the earth is been given unto the hands of the wicked, which are the Edomites, man. So-called white people. You know, starting with the banking families, the elites, all the way down, man, to your so-called presidents. All right, your rulers and everything. Verse 5, Ezekiel 35:5, because thou hast had a perpetual hatred, that goes into a never-ending hatred, and hast shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword in the time of their calamity, in the time that their iniquity had an end. You see? Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord Yahweh Power, I will prepare thee unto blood, and blood shall pursue thee, sith thou hast not hated blood, even blood shall pursue thee. Thus will I make Mount Seir most desolate, and cut off from it him that passeth out, and him that returneth. You see, so the Lord's gonna return your own recompense, man. A recompense, forgive me. The Lord's gonna return a recompense against you Edomites, man. Ultimately, as we read in Obadiah, all right, where's that at? Obadiah 1:10, for thy violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever, after a bloodshed is come upon you, man. According to the scriptures, that's going to be by the hands of our Lord and Savior, Yahushua, man. All right, so with that, Lord willing, this lesson was edifying. Like I said, I just want to go into a little bit on these articles, how these so-called Europeans, under deceits and lies, man. Ultimately, we understand, it was the will of Yahweh Shem Yahushai. They invaded and conquered our people, man. But the Lord had mercy. All right, and yet still show, still with us, man, till this day. Okay, so with that, Lord willing, this lesson was edifying. I want to give all praises to Yahweh, Bahashim Yahweh Shai, Bahashim Rakakwadash. Double honors to the apostles, elder bishops of Great Millstone. Until the next one, Shalom.